It simply arrived, savage, merciless, roaring down from the Wyoming mountains with teeth of ice and a voice like judgment. Snow whipped sideways, wind clawed through the station walls as if trying to rip the world apart. Inside, in the feeble light of a single lantern, a woman sat alone, back rigid with hard-won pride, a worn medical bag resting beside her like an old friend. In her hands, $3, nothing more. And yet her eyes burned with something unbreakable. Then the door exploded inward. A colossal figure stepped through the blizzard, snow falling from his broad shoulders, his dark gaze locking onto her with quiet intensity. Neither spoke, but, in that frozen breath between them, fate had already drawn its line, and neither would ever be the same again. The storm didn't ask permission. It just came, rolled down from the mountains like it owned everything below, like the sky had finally decided it was done being patient. Wind screaming through the gaps in the station walls. Snow coming sideways. The kind of cold that doesn't just touch your skin. It gets inside, the soft places, stays there. December 1887, and Miriam Voss was sitting on a wooden bench that had no business being this hard, hands folded in her lap, back straight, the way her mother taught her, the way the hospital required. Chin up, eyes forward. Look like you belong somewhere even when you don't. Even when you have $3. $3, and a medical bag and a name that had been dragged through every respectable parlor in Philadelphia until it wasn't worth the breath it took to say it. She didn't cry. She had decided, somewhere between Pittsburgh and here, that she was done crying. Crying required hope. Hope required believing things could get better. And right now, on this bench, in this storm, in this nowhere place at the edge of everything, she wasn't sure she believed that anymore. The bag sat beside her, worn leather, brass clasps her father had polished the day she graduated from nursing training. He'd been so proud. Stood there with his hat in his hands and tears he wouldn't let fall and said, "Miri, you're going to save lives." Like that was a simple thing. Like saving lives was something the world actually wanted from a woman. She knew better now. She knew what the world wanted from a woman. And she knew what happened when you refused to give it. Philadelphia had been cold in a different way. Not weather cold, people cold. The kind of cold that lives in polished offices and starched collars, and the particular silence that falls over a room when Dr. Silas Prairie walks in, and everyone straightens up like flowers, turning toward a sun that might burn them. He had been her supervisor, her superior, the man whose signature went on every document that mattered in her professional life. He had also been a problem for a very long time. Not the obvious kind of problem. Not loud. Not dramatic. Prairie was too smart for that. It was the hand that lingered 2 seconds too long. The comment that could mean nothing, could mean everything, depending on how she responded. The way he'd appear in the supply corridor when no one else was around. Always with a reason. Always with a smile that knew something she didn't. She had managed it, the way women manage things. Carefully, quietly. Always one step to the left of where he expected her to be. Until the night she couldn't be, late shift. Ward C, she'd been restocking the medication cabinet when she heard the door. Heard the lock. What followed was not a conversation. What followed was a choice. She chose the bedpan. It was the closest thing. It was heavy. It connected with his nose at an angle she would have found impressive under different circumstances. The sound, she still heard it sometimes. In the quiet moments. A sharp, wet crack. He went down. She walked out. And that should have been the end of it. Except this was Philadelphia. And he was Prairie. And when a woman breaks a man's nose in that city, in that hospital, in that year, it is never the end of it. It is the beginning of something much worse. The board met without her. She knew the outcome before the letter arrived. Dismissed for conduct unbecoming a professional. Her nursing certificates rendered meaningless by a single paragraph, signed 6 by 6 men who had never once worked a night shift. Word spread the way bad news always does. Fast. Sideways. Into every conversation before she could get there first. She tried 3 other hospitals, then 4, then she stopped counting. She took what money she had, bought a ticket west. Thought, somewhere west there must be places that need healers, more than they need stories about who those healers used to be. Maybe she'd been right, maybe she'd been desperate. Maybe there was no difference. The bench was getting colder. She shifted, tried to find a position her spine would forgive. Looked at the station clock, looked at the window. Nothing out there but white and dark and more white. The last eastbound train had left at 6. She hadn't been on it. Couldn't afford the ticket back. Couldn't afford a room. The boarding house on 2nd Street had looked at her remaining funds and looked at her face and said very politely that they were full. They were not full. $3. She'd counted it twice, then once more for the comfort of the counting, which provided none. The medical bag was worth more than everything else she owned. She'd thought about selling it. Thought about it for approximately 4 seconds before something in her chest locked up completely and refused to consider it further. The instruments were hers. Her father had bought the first set. She'd replaced them piece by piece as she could afford to. Each one had a history. Each one had a name she'd stitched to a patient who'd walked out of the hospital because of what those instruments could do in her hands. You didn't sell that. You didn't sell what you were. She pulled her shawl tighter. It was thin. It had been adequate in Pennsylvania. Out here, adequate was a joke. She was thinking about the thin shawl and the $3, and the very realistic possibility of freezing to death on this bench when the door opened. Not quietly. Nothing about this was quiet. The door went wide. Wind came through first, like it was announcing something. Snow swirled into the station in a long, cold exhale, and then the man filled the doorway, and the wind stopped. Simply stopped. Because there was no space left for it. He was large. That was the first thing. Not the tall and thin kind of large that Philadelphia produced in abundance. The other kind. The kind that suggested his skeleton was built on a different scale than most people's. Shoulders wide enough that he had to angle slightly through the door. Coat made of something that looked like it had been an animal not long ago. Dark fur, heavy, practical, his face. Or what she could see of it, which wasn't much. A beard. Black. Thick. The kind of beard that meant either profound conviction or a complete indifference to what other people thought. And from the look of him, she suspected both. Snow caught in it. Snow caught in his hair, too. Dark, long enough to be tied back, with what looked like a strip of leather. His hat was wide-brimmed and pulled low against the weather, and when he pushed through the door and let it close behind him, he knocked the snow off it with one hand in a single, practiced motion. His eyes found her immediately, brown, dark, the kind of eyes that didn't ask permission either. He looked at her the way people look at problems they're trying to calculate. Not rude, not unkind, just direct. Like he'd already decided to assess the situation honestly, and wasn't planning to dress that assessment up for her comfort. She straightened her spine. He looked away. Moved to the counter where the station master had retreated, collar turned up against Don's own drafts. She watched him from the side. His boots were not expensive. They were simply good, the kind of good that comes from use rather than price. Same with the coat. Same with everything about him. Nothing decorative. Everything functional. He moved like a man who had never once considered what he looked like moving. She heard the conversation without meaning to. The station master's voice. Higher, apologetic. Pharmacies closed, Mr. Gideon. Storm brought everything down early, the man. Low. Not much of a response. Just something short and final. And the doctor? Left for Laramie yesterday. Won't be back until Thursday if the pass clears. Silence. The kind with weight in it. She looked back at the window. None of her business. She had her own problems to count, $3 of them. She heard him cross the room. She didn't look up. Kept her eyes on her hands. Hands that had held instruments steady through surgeries that would have made grown men faint. Hands that were currently folded in her lap, Perfectly still, because they had nothing to do, and Miriam Voss did not know what to do with herself when her hands had nothing to do. The bench beside her. The sound of weight settling onto it. She looked up. He was sitting. Not close. 2 feet of bench between them. He'd taken his hat off and was holding it in his hands, and he was looking at her medical bag with an expression she couldn't entirely read. "That bag," he said. "What's in it?" She held still. "Medical supplies." His eyes moved to her face. "Instruments?" "Yes. You know how to use them." "Not a question." "Still," she answered, "I'm a trained nurse." Something shifted in his face. Not quite relief. Something more complicated. The look of a man recalculating odds. He didn't say anything for a moment, just sat, turning his hat in his hands. Slowly. One rotation, then another. Like he was thinking something through and wasn't going to speak until he'd finished thinking it. She waited. She didn't know why. She waited. She could have looked away. She could have made it clear this conversation was over. She didn't. He said, "I have a boy up on my property, 18 miles north. He took a bad fall 3 days ago, broke some ribs, started running a fever this morning." He paused. "The fever's what worries me." Miriam's chest did something. A small, automatic tightening. The part of her that was always a nurse even when nothing else was working. "Rib fractures with fever can mean pneumonia," she said, "or a punctured lung that's getting infected. Either one is serious, I know." His jaw moved. "I came for morphine, and to find Whitmore." A short pause. "Whitmore's the doctor." "Yes, I gathered." He looked at the bag again, then at her. And then, with the economy of a man who did not use extra words, because he genuinely did not see the point of them, he said, "You don't have anywhere to sleep tonight." She opened her mouth. He wasn't in being cruel, he wasn't being presumptuous. He was just stating what he'd observed in the same tone he'd used to discuss rib fractures. Flat, true, without decoration. She started. "The storm's getting worse," he said. "Next train east isn't until morning, maybe longer if the track's ice over." He looked at her shawl. She watched him look at it and dislike what he saw. "That's not enough for tonight." "I'm fine," she said. He didn't argue. Just looked at her with those dark eyes in a way that said, plainly, "We both know that isn't true, and lying about it doesn't change the temperature." She felt something move in her. Annoyance, and underneath the annoyance, something that might have been the first small ember of something she'd nearly forgotten. He put his hat on the bench, reached into his coat, set something down between them, a coin, then another. "One night's work," he said. "You come up. Check the boy. Tell me what's wrong and what to do about it. I'll get you back to town before the next train." He looked at her directly. "That's all I'm asking." She looked at the coins. She looked at him. She looked at the medical bag. "What's wrong with the boy?" she said slowly. "Is something you want a trained nurse to assess." A pause. "Not a doctor." "I can't find a doctor," he said. "You're here. That's not exactly a ringing endorsement of my qualifications." "No," he agreed. "But you know things I don't, and I need those things tonight." He stood, picked up his hat. "Cubs 19? Something moved in his face. Just for a second. Then gone. "He matters to me." She didn't ask who Cub was. She didn't ask anything. She looked at the coins, the shawl, the window, the $3 she had left. She picked up her medical bag. "I'll need to know his symptoms," she said. "All of them. Starting from when he fell." Something happened in his face. So quick she almost missed it. Not a smile. Too contained for that. But something. "Gideon," he said. "Holt Gideon, Miriam Voss." He nodded once. "Let's go." She had been cold before. She had not been cold like this. The horse was enormous. Of course it was. Everything about this man appeared to be scaled differently than the world she came from. Black stallion, broad-chested, steam rising from its breath in visible clouds. It didn't flinch in the wind. Just stood there solid, like it had decided weather was beneath its notice. Gideon helped her up with the efficiency of someone who had done this before, and had no strong feelings about it either way. No ceremony, no awkwardness. Just a hand, a boost, and she was seated behind him, and they were moving. Before she'd finished deciding how she felt about any of this, she held the medical bag across her lap. The wind hit her from 3 directions at once. "Oh, this was cold. Hold on," he said, over his shoulder. Into the wind, she held on. The first 10 minutes were about survival. The next 20 were about something else. The storm was loud. She couldn't have made conversation if she'd wanted to. And the horse moved in a steady, ground-eating rhythm that was surprisingly stable. She focused on that. The rhythm. The solid warmth of his back in front of her. The fact that the horse didn't slip, didn't hesitate, took the dark bends in the road, like it had memorized every one of them. Which it probably had. She began to notice things. He knew this road. Not just knew it belonged to it. When the trail curved, he shifted his weight a fraction of a second before the curve appeared. When a gust hit broadside, he leaned just slightly, creating a break in the wind that she moved into without thinking. He wasn't performing any of this. He just knew. The way you know the layout of your own kitchen in the dark. This was his territory. She was a stranger in it. The mountains appeared gradually. Not all at once. Nothing so dramatic. Just the sense of the land rising, of the sky changing shape overhead, of the trees getting denser and the snow getting deeper. The wind was still awful, but it was a different kind of awful up here. Less directionless. More intentional. Like it had somewhere to be. She was shivering steadily. He didn't ask if she was all right. He just adjusted. Angled his body. Not all the way. Just enough. She didn't say anything. He didn't explain. It simply happened, and the wind hit her left side instead of her chest, and she was slightly less cold. She filed that away. Filed it next to the coins on the bench. The look he'd given her shawl. The way he'd said, "Cub matters to me," with all the plain simplicity of a man who didn't know how to be less than honest about things that cost him. The property appeared out of the dark, and the snow like something conjured. Not a grand estate. She'd half expected. She didn't know what she'd expected. Something that matched the scale of him, maybe. Something imposing. This was not that. It was a cluster of buildings built to last. Solid log construction, stone foundations, roofs that knew how to carry snow. A barn, a smaller outbuilding. The main house, bigger than the others. 2 stories, a covered porch wrapping around 2 sides. Warm light in the windows. The particular warm light of places where people actually live. Several windows in the barn were lit too. She could hear, underneath the wind, the low sound of cattle. A man appeared on the porch before they'd fully stopped. Older, 60s, she'd guess, with a beard gone mostly silver, and a left leg that didn't quite cooperate when he moved down the porch steps. He came out without a coat on, like he'd forgotten it in his hurry. Or like he'd long since decided cold was something that happened to other people. "Amos," Gideon said. "He's worse." The older man, not a greeting. Straight to it. Fever's up. Won't drink anything. Started coughing about an hour ago. Gideon was off the horse. He helped her down, took the reins, handed them off to a younger man who'd appeared from the barn. "Coughing how?" Miriam said. Both men looked at her. Amos's eyes, assessing, not unfriendly, but not ready to extend trust he hadn't been asked to extend yet, moved over her quickly. "Taking inventory. Wet," he said. "Like something's in there." Her chest tightened again. "Take me inside." The house was warm. That was the first thing. A deep wood stove warmth that reached into her immediately and made her realize fully how cold she'd been. The entry was simple, practical. Hooks for coats. A bench for boots. A braided rug that had been cleaned so many times it had softened into something almost beautiful. She followed Amos upstairs that announced every step. Down a hallway. Into a room on the right. Cub was in the bed. He looked younger than 19. That was her first thought. Or maybe it was just that sick people always looked younger than they were. Some essential vitality stripped away by fever that made them seem unfinished. He was long, the height of a young man who'd grown faster than his frame could fully account for, but his face in the lamplight was soft. Dark smudges under his eyes, lips cracked, chest moving in a way she didn't like. She was across the room before she'd finished thinking, bag open, instruments in hand. She pressed the back of her wrist to his forehead. Hot, yes, very hot. Then began the examination. Systematic, efficient. She didn't explain what she was doing to the two men who had followed her in. She didn't have attention to spare for that, his breathing. She listened for what felt like a long time. The left side, the sound she heard there. All right, she said. She stayed very still for a moment, keeping her expression neutral the way she'd learned. Because patients took their cues from you, and family took their cues from you, and panic was contagious in a way that helped no one. She turned. Gideon was standing near the door, arms at his sides, watching her, not cub her, like he was reading her face for the verdict. She gave him what she could. Left lung has fluid, she said. The ribs didn't puncture it, but the inflammation spread. If we don't bring the fever down and drain what's accumulating. She didn't finish. How long ago did this start? 3 days since the fall, he said. Fever since this morning. We caught it early enough, she said. If we work tonight, he nodded, once. Tell me what you need. Water boiling, clean cloth, not fabric, linen if you have it. Good light, 2 lamps here and here, she pointed. And I need you. She looked at Gideon, to stay out of my way unless I ask for something. Amos was already moving. Gideon stood where he was. She looked at him. The briefest exchange. His face said plainly, I'll do whatever you need. And I'll stay exactly where you put me, she nodded. Turned back to Cub. She worked for 3 hours, not surgery. This wasn't that, not yet. But close work, careful work. The fever had to come down first before anything else was possible. Cool cloths. Measured dosing from her own supplies. She had enough. Barely enough. She worked the breathing, kept him conscious for long enough to drink small amounts. Monitored the lung with everything she had, which was a lot, but not as much as she'd have wanted. The lamps were exactly where she'd asked. The water was always hot when she needed it. The linen appeared without her asking twice. At some point she registered, in the back of her mind, that Gideon had been doing this, anticipating each need. Not hovering, not asking questions. Just quietly, without announcement, making the next thing ready before she had to ask. She didn't look at him directly. She couldn't afford the distraction. But she felt it, the particular quality of a person who understands that the best help is invisible. There was a moment, around 2 in the morning, when Cub's fever broke. She felt it in her hands first, that unmistakable shift from dry heat to the slightly cooler, damp warmth of a body releasing what had been burning it. She kept her face still, kept her hands moving. But something loosened in her chest that she hadn't realized was clenched. He was going to be all right, not out of danger entirely. He'd need watching. He'd need care for days. But the worst of it, the part that had been most likely to kill him quietly in the night, that part had turned. She sat back at last. Just for a moment, let her hands rest, and then she noticed the ceramic mug sitting on the small table beside her. Steam rising from it. The smell of something warm and slightly bitter. Tea, real tea, not the pale imitation she'd had in cheap boarding houses. And beside it, a piece of bread with a thick smear of something she was too tired to identify. She hadn't heard him put it there. She hadn't heard anything. She picked up the mug, with both hands, and held it. Just held it. Gray was starting in the windows when she finally stood and walked downstairs. The main room. Low fire still burning. Gideon was at the table with a cup of his own and a book open in front of him, though he didn't appear to be reading it. He looked up when she came down. She sat in the chair across from him without asking. He'll need monitoring for at least a week, she said. No writing, no work, lots of fluid. If the cough gets wetter or the fever comes back, the left lung. I know, he said. I'll watch it. You'll know what to watch? He looked at her, something steady in it. I've managed injuries before. We're 20 miles from the nearest doctor on a good day. A pause. You learn what you need to learn. She looked at the book. Her eyes, tired as they were, found the title automatically. Gray's Anatomy, 1858 edition. She'd trained with the 1871 printing. His copy looked like it had been read many times. The spine was soft, the corners rounded. She could see, even from here, writing in the margins. Small, cramped, someone working hard to fit thoughts into small spaces. "Where did you get that?" she said. "Traveling merchant, 1880. He didn't seem embarrassed, didn't seem proud, just stating a fact. "It was expensive. I paid it." She looked at his hands on the table, scarred, large, the knuckles of a man who worked with them every day. And she thought about those hands, moving through this book, reading it in the lamplight in this house on this mountain, year after year, alone. She almost said something. She didn't. Instead, she looked around the room properly for the first time. Really looked, the bookshelves. There were more books than she'd expected. Not a gentleman's library, not arranged for appearance. These were read. These were used. She could see Thoreau. She could see something that looked like a medical text on plant properties. She could see her eyes stopped in the shelf above the desk. A leather envelope, old. The kind used for official correspondence. Tucked behind a row of books. Not hidden exactly, but not displayed either. Just there. The way things live in the spaces of a house when they're things you can't get rid of, but can't quite look at directly. She looked away. None of her business. She was here for one night. She had done the work she came to do. She would sleep a few hours, and then she would go back down to Cheyenne, and she would figure out the next thing. That was all. That was all this was. "You can have the room at the end of the hall," Gideon said. "The one on the right." He'd stood at some point. She hadn't noticed. He was moving toward the stairs. "I'll be in the barn if Cub needs anything." "The barn? It's where I sleep when there's company." She stopped. "That's not necessary." He looked at her over his shoulder. "Just for a moment," he said. "I'll wake you if anything changes." He went up the stairs. She heard his footsteps, heard a door open, then close. Then the back door, quieter. Then nothing. She sat in the chair for a long moment. The fire popped. She should sleep. She knew she should sleep. Her body was telling her, loudly and without ambiguity, that sleep was the correct next step. Instead, she stood and crossed to the bookshelf. She didn't let herself take the envelope down. That was too much. She only looked at it, at the corner that was visible, at the way it was positioned, not with the other correspondence, not with the household papers, but here, among books, among the things he read and returned to. Someone had written his name on the front of it, Holt Gideon, and above that a return address, Denver College of Medicine, Denver, Colorado Territory. She looked at it for a long time. Then she went upstairs and slept. She didn't dream. She was too tired for dreams. When she woke, light was coming through the window at an angle that told her it was past 9. She sat up, listened. The house had the particular quiet of a place where people are going about their business at a respectful distance. She checked Cub first. He was sleeping naturally, real sleep, not the restless heat sleep of the night before. His breathing was better, noticeably, meaningfully better. She stood in the doorway and watched him, breathed and felt the specific satisfaction of a problem moving in the right direction. Downstairs, the smell of something cooking. A woman was at the stove. Compact, efficient, gray hair braided tight. She turned when Miriam appeared and said, "Sit down," in a tone that was not unkind but left no room for argument. She set a plate on the table, eggs, bacon, bread that was still warm from wherever it had come from. "Martha," the woman said. Amos's wife. Sit. Miriam sat. She ate. She couldn't remember the last time food had tasted like this. Maybe it was just hunger. Probably it was just hunger. Though the bread was genuinely remarkable. "Boy's going to live," Martha said. "Not a question if he rests," Miriam said. Martha made a sound that suggested getting Cub to rest would be its own medical challenge. "He never does," she confirmed. "That boy has the stillness of a creek in July from outside, the sound of axes, wood being split, the steady, rhythmic sound of it." Miriam looked at the window. Through the glass she could see the yard, and in the yard, Gideon, working his way through a pile of logs. with the focused efficiency of a man who did not waste effort. She watched for a moment before she realized she was watching. Looked back at her plate. He was up all night. Martha said conversationally. After you went to sleep, sat outside the boys' door till 3. Then came in and checked on you. Miriam looked up. Didn't go in, Martha said, meeting her eyes briefly. Just listened at the door to make sure you were breathing right. You'd gotten cold, coming up. She turned back to the stove. He was concerned. Miriam looked back at her plate. She didn't know what to do with that information. She ate her bread. He came in mid-morning, stamping snow off his boots. She was at the table with a cup of coffee that Martha had provided without being asked. He got his own coffee, sat down across from her with the ease of a man in his own home, who had no performance to give. How is he? He said. Better. The fever's gone for now. Breathing has improved. She wrapped her hands around the mug. He needs a week of actual rest. The ribs will take longer. 6 weeks, probably, before he should be doing anything strenuous. Gideon nodded slowly. He drank his coffee. She drank hers. The clock on the wall ticked. Somewhere in the barn an animal moved. Outside wind, but lighter now. The storm had mostly spent itself. Amos's wife mentioned 3 women, Miriam said, in the community, expecting. He looked at her. Word travels, he said. Martha mentioned it. She set her cup down, leveled her gaze. No midwife? Mrs. Falk. He paused. She passed in October, a beat. There's no one trained. No one who's done it properly. She looked at her hands. She looked at the window. She thought about the train she'd missed. About the money she didn't have. About Cheyenne and the boarding house. And the particular weight of $3 when $3 is everything you have. She thought about 3 women. Expecting, she said, I could stay a while longer. He didn't react immediately. He looked at her steadily, with those calculating dark eyes, and she had the sense of him measuring something, not her qualifications, not her usefulness, something else, something more careful. That would be your choice to make, he said finally, not mine, and if I made it, then you'd have a room, meals, pay. He said it plainly, and work that needs doing. She looked at him for a long moment. He held her gaze without difficulty, without agenda, as far as she could tell. With the patience of a man who lived on a mountain and had learned that most things resolved themselves if you waited long enough, and didn't manufacture urgency where none was needed. All right, she said. He nodded once, picked up his coffee, drank it. She went upstairs to check on Cub. The weeks that followed were not what she'd expected. She hadn't expected to sleep well. She did. The mountain air did something to sleep, made it deeper, more complete, the kind you woke from feeling like a different person than the one who lay down. She hadn't expected to find her Sastol satisfying, in the way it turned out to be satisfying. Not the grand emergencies, those she was trained for, those she knew, but the smaller things, the daily things. Teaching Martha the signs of fever versus the normal heat of hard labor. Sitting with a man who'd hurt his hand on a fence post and listening to him talk while she cleaned the wound, because no one had listened to him talk in a while. Tending. That was the word. She'd become a nurse because she wanted to heal people. She'd forgotten, somewhere in the efficiency of the Philadelphia hospital system, that healing people was not the same as tending to them. That tending was its own thing, its own kind of medicine. And Gideon. She had not expected Gideon. Not any of it. Not the way he moved through his own property, with the ease of something native, something that had grown from the same ground it stood on. Not the way he spoke, sparsely, precisely, each word apparently selected for its load-bearing capacity. Not the way he was with Cub, who recovered slowly and badly, who was restless and irritable and absolutely refused to believe that 6 weeks meant 6 weeks. She watched, one afternoon, as Gideon sat with the boy on the porch in the weak winter sun. Not talking, just sitting. Cub was carving something from a bit of wood, badly, because his ribs still made every motion difficult. Gideon was mending a piece of tack. They didn't speak for a long time. And then Cub said something she couldn't hear from the window, and Gideon said something back. And Cub laughed, genuinely laughed, and Gideon's mouth moved in what would have been, on someone else, a broad smile. On him it was just the corner lifting, but it was real. She moved away from the window. It was a Tuesday evening when she found it. She hadn't been looking for anything. She'd come downstairs for water and stopped at the bookshelf out of the habit she'd developed of reading titles when she passed. A cataloging impulse, purely professional. And the envelope had moved, not much. Just shifted slightly from where she remembered it. Like it had been taken down and replaced. She shouldn't. She definitely shouldn't. She took it down. Inside was a single page. Formal letterhead. Denver College of Medicine, 1879. The letter was addressed to Holt E. Gideon. It was brief. These letters were always brief. Dear Mr. Gideon, we have received your application for the Fall 1879 program. After careful review, we regret that we are unable to offer admission at this time. Our program requires demonstrated academic preparation at the secondary level, which your application does not evidence. We wish you well in your future endeavors. That was it. No, we appreciate your interest. No, please consider applying again. You don't have the right paper. Good luck with your life. She stood there holding this letter for a long time. The man had sat in this house, on this mountain, alone, and taught himself out of a second-hand textbook that was 12 years out of date at the time he bought it, had learned things that took other people years of formal instruction, had kept notes in the margins, had built a working knowledge of medicine adequate enough that she could direct him through a difficult procedure in the dark. And he had not made a single error, and a letter on a Tuesday in 1879 had told him, no, you don't have the paper. Good luck with your life. She put the letter back carefully, exactly as she'd found it. She stood at the bookshelf for another moment. Then she went upstairs and sat on the edge of her bed and looked at her own hands and thought about what it meant to be told no by the wrong people, and what it cost, and how much of it you carried, and whether you were even aware anymore of how much you were carrying. She had her own version of that letter. It had been delivered in person by 6 men, in a room she'd been allowed into only to be told she was no longer welcome in it. She'd thought, when she left Philadelphia, that she was leaving that letter behind. She was beginning to understand you didn't leave things like that behind. You carried them. You just, eventually, got strong enough that you stopped noticing the weight. She was not in love with him. She was very clear about this with herself. She noticed him. That was different. She noticed the way he came into a room, without announcement, without seeking attention, just present. She noticed the hands. She noticed the particular timbre of his voice on the rare occasions he said something that mattered to him. She noticed the flute, the wooden flute. She had heard it for the first time on a Thursday night, 6 weeks in, lying awake listening to the mountain. A sound from the direction of the barn, low, slow. Not a tune she recognized. Nothing with a name, she thought. Nothing written down anywhere. Just sound. Moving through the dark with the patience of something that had always been there and wasn't asking permission. She'd lain very still and listened until it stopped. In the morning she'd asked Amos, as casually as she could manage. I heard music last night. Amos had looked at her sideways. His mother's flute, he said. She died when he was 14. It's the only thing of hers he kept. She'd said nothing, but she'd thought about it for the rest of the day and several days after. A man who'd lost his mother at 14, who'd wanted to be a doctor and been told no, who lived alone on a mountain and read medical textbooks and played his dead mother's flute in the dark because, why? Because something in him still needed to. Because some things you carry so long, they become just. She was not in love with him. She was paying attention to him. And the problem with paying attention to someone like Holt Gideon was that the more attention you paid, the more there was to see. The incident happened on a Wednesday, late afternoon. A man named Decker One of the hands who worked with Amos on the property came running across the yard with his face white as the snow behind him. "Tritty came down," he said. "Morrison's under it." She was running. Before she'd thought about running, the man on the ground was breathing. That was the first thing she checked and the most important thing, and for one very long second, she'd been afraid it would go the other way. But he was breathing, badly, shallowly. 2 ribs on the right side. She pressed carefully, heard him gasp, felt the wrongness of it under her hands. "I need him moved," she said, carefully, "into the house. I need the table cleared. Moving him could. Someone started. Not moving him will definitely." She looked up, found Gideon standing 3 feet away, having appeared from somewhere without sound. "The ribs need to be stabilized and I need better light. Can you take his shoulders?" He was already crouching. They moved Morrison in a way that was about as good as it could be, which was not perfect but was the best possible under the circumstances. Into the house, onto the cleared table. 2 lamps materialized. Water was already hot. She heard it, the particular sound of the kettle, and looked up to find Amos's wife standing at the stove, with an expression that said, "I had a feeling." She worked. Gideon stood at the man's right side and did exactly what she told him. When she said, "Hold this," he held it. When she said, "More pressure," he gave more pressure. When she said, "Stop," he stopped. No questions. No second guessing. Just immediate, precise compliance. The way someone who actually understands what you're doing complies, rather than the way someone who's afraid complies. 40 minutes. The ribs were set and bound. Morrison's breathing had steadied. She stepped back. Her hands were shaking slightly. They did that sometimes, after. Not from weakness, but from the release of the concentration that had been holding them steady. Something appeared at her left side, a mug. Ceramic. Steam. She took it, held it with both hands. Didn't look. When she looked, he had already moved to the other side of the table to check Morrison's color. She looked at Amos. Amos was looking at Gideon. Then he looked at her. His old eyes were dry and frank and slightly amused, in the way of someone who has seen many things and has stopped being surprised by any of them. "He boiled the water," Amos said quietly, when Decker was still running across the yard. Before anyone knew what had happened, she looked at the mug in her hands. She thought about the envelope, the letter, the margins of the book, the flute in the dark. She thought about a man who paid attention before anyone asked him to. Not in love with him, paying attention. But the distance between those two things, she was beginning to understand, was not as large as she'd assumed. She drank the tea. Outside, the mountain was very quiet, and the winter held on. Spring came to the mountain without asking permission, same as the storm had come, same as everything up here came, on its own terms, in its own time, without the courtesy of announcement. One morning the snow was still deep, and the sky still the particular white-gray of a winter that had forgotten how to end. And then one morning it wasn't. The eaves dripped. The south-facing slopes showed brown through the white. The horses in the barn got restless in a new way. Not the restlessness of cold animals wanting warmth. The restlessness of warm-blooded things, remembering what open ground felt like. Miriam noticed it first through her window. A bird. Small, brown. Sitting on fence post outside the room that had become, over the course of 4 months, simply her room. It sat there for a long moment in the thin March sunlight, and then flew off toward the tree line, and she watched it go and realized she was smiling. She hadn't noticed herself smiling. That was new. She had not left. That was the plain fact of it. She had said a while longer, and a while longer had become December, and then January, and then February, and now this bird in March. She'd stopped counting when she'd stopped expecting herself to leave. The 3 women had delivered safely. All 3. One in January during a storm that had taken everything she had and left her sitting on the floor of a small cabin afterward, back against the wall, hands in her lap, too tired to stand. Martha had brought her soup, sat beside her on the floor and not said a single word. Just sat there, Miriam had appreciated that more than she could have explained. The work had shaped itself into something she hadn't expected. Not just the emergencies, the daily round of it. The man with the bad knee who came every Tuesday. The woman who needed someone to talk to about her headaches, who Miriam quickly understood, needed someone to talk to, full stop. The children who needed their cuts cleaned and their mothers needed to see someone remain calm while cleaning them. She had a system now, a real one. The room Gideon had built. Had simply built, without discussion. In November appeared one morning as a proper medical space where a storage room had been. Had shelves in order, and the smell of medicines she'd sourced from Cheyenne on Amos's supply runs. She had sent a letter to a doctor in Denver. An old contact, someone who had been kind to her once before everything went wrong, and who she thought might still be kind to her now. She had sent, along with the letter, her careful records, 4 months of them. Every patient, every treatment, every outcome, written in her small, precise hand because she was a nurse and nurses. Documented everything, because documentation was the difference between knowing and guessing. She had not told anyone she'd sent it. Not yet. Cub was fully recovered by February, which meant he was a problem again. She'd grown fond of him, in the way you grew fond of a stray cat that kept appearing on your porch with inexplicable confidence. He was 19 and entirely certain that being 19 meant having good judgment, which it did not, which she told him regularly. He received this information with great cheerfulness and continued doing whatever he'd been planning to do. She found him one afternoon, attempting to climb onto a horse he had been explicitly, clearly, in no uncertain terms, told not to ride for another 2 weeks. She said his name once. He froze. She said nothing else. Simply looked at him. He climbed down, patted the horse apologetically. Walked past her toward the barn without making eye contact. Muttered audibly, "I wasn't going to go fast." She turned away before he could see her face, because she was laughing, silently, completely. The kind of laughing that used muscles she'd forgotten she had. She pressed her hand over her mouth and walked the other direction and did not look back. It was the evenings that were the problem. This was what she told herself. The evenings were the problem, because the evenings were when the work stopped, and there was nothing to do but be in the place she was in. And the place she was in, the main room, the low fire, the sound of wind outside doing something less aggressive than it had done all winter. That place had a quality she didn't have a clinical term for. She would call it peace. She hadn't felt it in so long she'd almost forgotten it had a name. Gideon was usually in the room. Not always, not intrusively. He had a habit of reading in the chair by the east window, with his feet on a low stool, and his coffee going cold beside him. Turning pages with the patience that suggested he was not performing reading but actually doing it. She had started in January to bring her own reading, to sit in the other chair, on the other side of the fire. They had developed, without discussion, without announcement, without either of them commenting on it, an evening arrangement. 2 people, 2 chairs, 2 books, occasional coffee, occasional conversation. Long silences that were not uncomfortable. The conversations, when they happened, were unlike any she'd had before. Not unlike because they were romantic. Not unlike because they were charged with anything obvious. Unlike because they were honest. Plainly, simply, unpretentiously honest. He asked her things and waited for the real answer. She asked him things, and he gave the real answer without embellishment or deflection. It was a quality she associated with children who hadn't yet learned to perform themselves and with very old people who'd stopped seeing the point. She did not associate it, generally, with 32-year-old men. Why medicine? She'd asked him once. Just asked it. Sitting there with her book, he'd thought about it. Actually thought. Not rushed into an answer. Because things go wrong up here, he said finally, and knowing what to do was the difference between keeping people and losing them. A pause. And because it was interesting. Another pause, more interesting than most things. She looked at the fire. "It is," she said. "More interesting than most things." He turned a page. That was the whole conversation. She thought about it for 3 days. The evenings were the problem, but the mornings were becoming something else entirely. He was always up before her. She had stopped being surprised by this. She came downstairs and there was coffee. Always coffee. Sometimes bread already cut and sitting under a cloth. The fire built up, not so high that it wasted wood, exactly high enough that the room was warm by the time she appeared. She had never once asked for any of this. He had never once mentioned doing it. One morning in late February, she came down earlier than usual. Couldn't sleep, something unsettled in her chest that she hadn't finished identifying, and found him at the table. Not reading. Just sitting with his coffee, looking out the window at the dark. He looked up when she came in, said nothing. She poured her coffee, sat down. They sat in the dark together while the sky went gradually lighter, and did not say a single word for a full hour. When Amos came in from the barn at 6, and found them sitting there in the thin early light, he looked at one, then the other, then poured himself coffee and sat at the far end of the table, and also did not say anything. Smart man, Amos, very smart man. Spring properly arrived in April, which meant the mud arrived. Great, impassable, boot-eating quantities of mud. Which meant Cub fell in it twice in 1 week. The second time, while trying very hard to demonstrate that he had not fallen in it the first time. Which meant Miriam stood on the porch and observed this with the expression she reserved for situations that were medically minor and humanly hilarious. "You're not going to help me," Cub said from the mud. "You don't appear to need medical assistance," she said. "I might, you don't. My dignity is injured. That's outside my area of practice." He got up. He was covered from knee to elbow. He looked at her with the wounded dignity of a very young man who had expected sympathy and received none. She went inside before she laughed again. She was doing that more. Laughing. She noticed the way you noticed a light that had been off for a long time. The switch turning. The slow, warm glow of it. She was not thinking about Philadelphia. She had not thought about Philadelphia in. She did the calculation. Weeks, real weeks. Not the usual not thinking about it, that was actually thinking about it constantly, just below the surface. Real absence. Real presence in the place she actually was. Something had shifted. She wasn't sure when. She was in the kitchen with Martha on the first real warm day when Holt came in. He didn't usually come in mid-morning. He was a man with a schedule, and the schedule was the schedule, and it did not include appearing in the kitchen at 10:30, with snow mud on his boots and something clearly on his mind. Martha looked at him once. Dried her hands on her apron. Said she needed to check on something in the garden. Left Martha sharp as a tack, that woman. He sat down at the table. She stayed where she was, at the counter, hands wrapped around her coffee. "Waiting," he said. "There's something I want to say, and I'm not sure I have the right words for it." She looked at him. He was looking at his hands on the table. Big hands. Scarred. The Gray's Anatomy hands. The hands that had held pressure on Morrison's ribs and heated water in the dark before anyone knew it was needed. "Then say it without the right words," she said. He looked up. He reached into his coat pocket and set something on the table between them, a flute, small, smooth, wood so pale it was almost white, different from the one she'd heard him play. She could tell even from here, even without touching it. Newer, the wood finished differently, more carefully, the mouthpiece shaped with extra attention. She looked at it, then at him. "I made it," he said. "Took about 3 weeks. I'm not." He stopped. "I'm not good at saying things. I've never been." He looked at the flute, not at her. "But I know what I want. I've known for a while." And I thought, a pause. Long enough that she held her breath. I thought that was worth saying. Even if I can't say it the way it should be said. She looked at the flute, she looked at him, she thought. 3 weeks. He made this over 3 weeks. Every day in the barn, or wherever he went, when he needed to be alone with something. 3 weeks of choosing the wood. shaping it, getting the sound right. Because he couldn't find the word, so he found something else. Her chest did something large and inconvenient. "Holt," she said. He finally looked at her directly. "Give me time," she said. "Not because I don't." She stopped, started again. I'm still figuring out who I am up here. And I need to know that before I know," he said. "You know? You're not someone who says yes before you're sure." He said it simply. Like this was obvious. Like he'd known this about her for long enough that it wasn't worth stating as anything other than fact. "I'm not asking you to be sure. I'm asking you to know that I am." She stood very still. He picked up his hat from the table where he'd set it when he came in. Stood. Left the flute where it was. "The south pasture fence needs work," he said, entirely normally. "I'll be out there until supper." He went out the back door. She stood at the counter. The flute sat on the table. The kitchen was extremely quiet. She picked it up. It was lighter than she expected. Smooth in a way that meant many hours of work. She ran her thumb along the mouthpiece. He'd shaped it smaller than his own. Smaller than his mother's, she guessed. Shaped it for her hands. She put it down, picked up her coffee. Set it down again because her hands weren't quite steady. She was not going to cry. She was absolutely not going to. She was fine. She was completely fine. She went to check on a patient. June came warm and sudden. The kind of June that made the winter feel like a different life. The mountains were green. The horses were out in the pasture and moving with the particular joy of animals that had survived something. The sky was a light color that Philadelphia never managed. Too wide, too high, too absolutely present. She had been here 6 months. She wrote this in her journal on a Tuesday. 6 months. And counted what was different and what was the same, and found the accounting more complex than she'd expected. Same, her name, her hands, her training, the medical bag, different. The way she slept, the way she breathed, the absence of a particular weight across her shoulders that she'd been carrying so long she'd thought it was just the shape of her. Different, the fact that she had not stopped thinking about a wooden flute sitting on her windowsill. She had moved it there, the day after. Put it on the sill where the light came in and left it. Didn't play it. She'd never learned. But it was there, in her sight line. Waiting. She had not given him an answer. He had not asked again. It was a Wednesday in June when everything stopped. She was in the medical room going through supplies when she heard it. The sound from the east pasture. Shouts first. Then the particular sound of she was moving before she'd processed it, grabbing the bag from its hook, out the door and running. Cub was on the ground. The horse, one of the younger ones, half broken, not yet reliable, stood 20 feet away, breathing hard, eyes white-rimmed. Cub was on his back in the grass, not moving. Not moving. She hit her knees beside him. He was breathing. She felt it with her hand on his chest before she looked for it. Breathing, but badly. Chest rising unevenly. His face was white, not the white of shock. The white of pain being held at a level the body couldn't process. She heard Gideon arrive behind her. She didn't look. She was already working. "Talk to me," she said. To Cub. "Nathaniel, open your eyes." He opened them. Barely chest, he managed. "Can't I know?" She kept her voice flat and certain, and she did not let her hands shake, even though something in her had gone very cold, because she knew what an impact like this could do, and she knew how fast it could go wrong, and she knew. She worked. She worked the way she worked when there was no room for anything else. Just the body in front of her and the knowledge in her hands and steps, the steps, one, and then the next, and then the next. She talked to him while she worked, not to comfort, to keep him present, to keep him in his body, in this field, in the specific sunlit June afternoon where she intended him to stay. "Holt," she said it without turning, "I need the table now. I need light and water, and tell me you have the supplies I listed for Morrison." "Already sending someone," he said, from right behind her. He'd been there this whole time. "I need to move him, on my count," she said. "Hold his left side. Here, don't let the chest rotate." They moved Cub like something precious and fragile and very heavy. across the field, through the door, onto the table that had already been cleared. Someone, she didn't know who, had already cleared it. The next hour was not the worst hour of her professional life, but it was close. The ribs from his earlier injury, the ones she'd so carefully set in December, had not rebroken. But the new impact had done something to the space between. She worked with everything she had, every instrument, every technique she'd accumulated in 8 years of training and 3 of practice. Gideon stood opposite and did what she said, and she did not have to say anything twice, and at no point did he ask her if she was sure. She was sure. She was the only one in this room who was sure. And that certainty was the only thing holding the next hour together. At some point, she became aware that the room had filled. Quietly. Amos in the corner. Martha standing near the door. 2 or 3 others she didn't look at, just standing, waiting, doing nothing because there was nothing to do except hold the space steady for the person who knew what to do. The fever of the December injury had been frightening. This was worse. This was her hands in the dark on the worst kind of problem, and nothing between her and the outcome except what she knew. Cub 19 years old. Uncle Holt, he'd said in December, in the fever. Hadn't meant to say it, probably. Just where his mind went when it was looking for safety. Uncle Holt. She hadn't asked. She'd waited. And in February he'd told her, quietly, without drama, the way he told things. My brother died when Cub was 9. I went and got him. Brought him here, just that, I went and got him. Brought him here, no ceremony, no speech. Just the fact of it. Like a stone laid down. She was not going to lose this boy. She was not. When she finally stepped back, she was shaking, actually shaking. In her hands, in her arms, somewhere deep in her sternum where the effort had lived for the past. She looked at the clock, 2 hours and 11 minutes. Cub's breathing was even. His color was returning. Not good yet, but returning. The work was done. The rest was time. She put her instruments down. She became aware of the quiet in the room. Not the bad quiet, the waiting quiet. The crowd of people standing there who had been so still, for so long they'd become like furniture. Then Martha made a sound, low. Not quite a word. And Amos said, Lord. Just the one word. To the ceiling. Or to something beyond it. She turned. She needed air. She needed... Gideon was right there. He didn't say anything. He didn't touch her. He simply stepped aside, and she walked past him, through the door and onto the porch, and stood in the June evening air, breathing it in great long steadying breaths. Behind her, the door stayed open. She heard him come out. Heard him stand about 4 feet away and stay there. The mountains were gold and going purple in the falling light, the horses in the pasture. The sound of the creek she could hear if she paid attention. The smell of everything green and alive and breathing. She said, he was calling for you. A pause in December, when the fever was high. He said she stopped, composed herself. He said your name, in a way that, I know. Gideon said, why didn't you tell me? A long silence. The kind he took when he was actually considering how to answer. He matters to you, she said, more than. I mean, you, she turned. You have raised that child, for 10 years. And you never said. You never, what would I have said? I don't know something. He looked at her directly. The evening light on his face. The beard, the weathered skin. Those dark eyes that she had spent 6 months learning to read, and still didn't always get right. I brought him home, he said. That was the whole of it. She looked at him. He looked back, and she thought, this is who you are. You do not perform the things that matter to you. You simply do them. You brought a 9-year-old child home and raised him and never made a speech about it, and never expected anyone to hand you something for it, because that is not why you did it. She thought about the letter from Denver, turned back to the mountains before her face did something she hadn't decided to let it do. He's going to be all right. Steadier now. He needs watching. 2 days of real monitoring. After that, you'll be here. Gideon said. She paused. Yes, she said, I'll be here. She was not sure she was talking about Cub's recovery anymore. She was not sure he thought she was, either. Something happened after that night, not loudly. Nothing between them happened loudly. But something shifted. In the texture of the evenings, in the quality of the morning silences, in the way she had started, without deciding to notice where he was in a room at any given moment. The way you notice weather, not consciously, just awareness. She caught Amos watching her once. The old man had the expression of someone who had seen a very obvious thing arriving from a very long distance and had been waiting patiently for it to arrive. She raised her eyebrows. He returned to his coffee. She was updating her records on an afternoon in late June. The careful documentation she'd maintained since December, every patient, every outcome, detailed enough that she could see patterns in it. When Cub appeared in the doorway, he was not supposed to be up. She said this. "I feel fine," he said. "You don't feel anything accurately yet. Sit down." He sat in the chair across from her desk. He was watching her write. He had that look. The look of a 19-year-old with something on his mind that he was going to say whether she wanted him to or not. "You're staying," he said, not a question. "I work here," she said. "That's not what I mean." She kept writing. "He's different," Cub said. "Since you came." A pause. The boy collecting words that didn't come naturally. He used to play the flute at night, and it sounded like, I don't know, sad. Just sad. But for a long time now it sounds different. Like it's still sad, but there's something else in it. She stopped writing. "That's not a clinical observation," she said. "No," he agreed. "But it's true." She looked at the window. The mountain view she'd looked at every day for 6 months, and not once stopped finding remarkable. "Cub," she said carefully. "Go rest." He went. But he was smiling. That particular Cub's smile that meant he'd said the thing he came to say and considered his work done. She sat alone with her records. She picked up the pen, set it back down, looked at the flute on her windowsill. She had written to the Denver contact in April. It was now late June. She had begun to think the letter had not arrived, or that she'd misjudged the man's willingness to help, or simply that she'd asked for too much. Then Amos came back from a supply run on a Thursday with the mail. He set an envelope on the kitchen table in front of her, said nothing, went back out. She looked at it. Denver return address. Not the College of Medicine, a private address. Dr. Edmund Falk. It said. She opened it carefully. The letter inside was 3 pages. She read it once quickly, then again slowly. Then she put it face down on the table and sat with her hands flat and didn't move for a while. He had looked at her records, shown them to colleagues. Not as a favor, as a matter of professional interest, because what she'd documented was, apparently, of professional interest. Wound management under field conditions, fever progression in pneumonia cases, outcomes from procedures performed without hospital equipment. He wrote, "What you have compiled here is not merely clinical record-keeping. It is a body of evidence. I have shared it with 2 colleagues who share my assessment. There is interest, serious interest, in your methods." She read that part 3 times. She looked out the window. She thought, 6 months ago, I was on a bench in a train station with $3. I was a woman whose name had been made into a story that wasn't true. I was going west because there was no other direction to go. And in 6 months, working, just working, doing the job in front of her, keeping records, paying attention. She stood up, folded the letter, put it in her apron pocket. She had plans to make, but first, she found him at the south fence, where he always went when something needed mending. She had noticed this. He mended fences the way some men went to church, with a kind of focused, necessary attention that was about more than the fence. He looked up when he heard her coming. Didn't stop working. She stopped on the other side of the fence and looked at him. "I have something to tell you," she said. He waited. She told him about the letter. Flat, plain, all of it. She watched his face while she spoke, and his face did the thing it always did, stayed still, and gave almost nothing away. And she'd learned by now to look for the small things. The slight tension around his eyes. The way his jaw moved when something meant something to him. When she finished, he was quiet. Then, "They want to publish your work? They want to present it," she said, "at a conference in Denver in the fall. As evidence of frontier medical practice." He looked at the fence post. He stopped. "It's my records," she said. 8 months of my records. From this mountain. From these people." A pause. "Gideon, your name is in there. Some of the procedures. You assisted. You're part of this." He looked at her. She said, "There's something else." He waited again. Always waiting. Never rushing. She used to find this quality alien. Now she relied on it. Dr. Crane, Prairie, whatever he calls himself now. She heard her own voice flatten. "He's been asking questions in Cheyenne. About me. About this place. He sent a letter to the territorial office last month, questioning whether I have the practice to pass here." Something moved in Gideon's face. Something cold and still and very focused. "When did you find this out?" he said. "Amos heard something in town. And you didn't say." "I'm saying now." He looked at the mountains for a long moment. She watched him the way she watched patients who were deciding something, reading the signs. "He'll come," Gideon said finally. "Men like that. They don't stop until you make them stop." "I know. We'll go down and make him stop." She looked at him. "Not you alone," he said. And it wasn't quite an argument, and it wasn't quite an order. It was something else. "You came up this mountain alone. You don't have to handle whatever's coming alone." She was quiet for a moment. She looked at the fence, at his hands on the post, at the mountains behind him that she'd come to think of, without deciding to, as her mountains. "I sent those records," she said quietly, "because I wanted to be ready. Whatever he's planning, I wanted something in my hands before he could." "Smart," Gideon said. "Or paranoid." "Same thing sometimes," he said. "Up here," she almost smiled. She didn't. "He's not just coming for my license," she said. "He wants me back where he has leverage, where the rules work for him and not for me." Gideon looked at her steadily. "That's not going to happen, not a boast, not a promise dressed up in drama. Just a statement. Flat and final and rooted in the same ground he stood on." She believed him. She didn't know exactly when that had happened, when she'd started believing him as a reflex, when his word had become something she anchored things to. "There's one more thing," she said. She reached into her apron pocket. Not the letter. The other thing she'd been carrying all day, the flute. She held it out to him. He looked at it. Then at her. "I don't know how to play it," she said. "You'd have to teach me." A pause. "If you still." She didn't finish. He didn't make her finish. He took the flute from her hand, looked at it for a moment, set it gently on the fence post between them. Then he looked at her, and whatever was in his face in that moment, she was going to stop herself from finding a word for it. It was too large for a word. It was the letter from Denver and the barn, and the tea in the dark, and the hands on her windowsill, and the sound of his mother's flute, coming through the dark, for months before she understood what she was listening to. He said, "Come to supper." She said, "That's all?" He almost smiled. "That's where we start." She picked up the flute, put it back in her pocket, walked toward the house. He fell into step beside her. Not close, not far. The easy distance of two people who've learned each other's rhythm. The mountains were starting to go gold. The day was almost done, and then the sound of hoofbeats. Coming fast. Coming from the direction of the main road. Coming with the particular urgency that made her chest tighten before she'd consciously identified the sound. Gideon had stopped. Turned. Amos was riding in hard. Face set. Something in his hand, a paper, folded, a piece of correspondence. He pulled up short, looked at Gideon, then at her. Something in his eyes she didn't like. "Came in the late post," Amos said. "Messenger brought it up from town." He held out the paper. "It's official. From the territorial office." Gideon took it. He unfolded it. "Read it." His face gave nothing. He handed it to her. She read it. Her name, at the top. A formal complaint, filed by Dr. Silas Prairie of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, currently residing in Cheyenne, Wyoming Territory. Citing unlicensed medical practice. Citing conduct unbecoming. citing the same story she'd been trying to outrun since the night she'd picked up the bedpan. At the bottom, in formal territorial script, a hearing has been scheduled. You are required to appear. She lowered the paper. The mountains were very still. The gold had left them. Everything looked, suddenly, like December again when, she said. Amos said, 6 weeks. She looked at the paper, then at the mountains, then at the paper again. She thought 6 weeks. She had 6 weeks. She had the records. She had the letter from Denver. She had 8 months of work that spoke for itself, if anyone would let it speak. And she looked at Gideon. He was watching her. Not with worry. Not with the particular helpless concerns people showed when they didn't know what to do. With something steadier than that. Something that said, I know what you're capable of. I have watched you work. I know exactly what you are. We need to go to town, she said. Tomorrow, we do, he agreed. She handed the paper back to Amos, straightened her spine. The way her mother taught her, the way the hospital required. Chin up, eyes forward, look like you belong somewhere. She did belong somewhere. She belonged here. And she was going to prove it, not because she had to, not because she was afraid. Because she had done the work and she had the proof, and she was not going to let Silas Prairie take the best 8 months of her life and make them into something shameful. She went inside. She had plans to write. 6 weeks. It was enough. She was going to make it enough. But the house was quiet when she came downstairs later that night. Too quiet. The fire low. Martha and Amos gone to their cabin, Cub asleep. The kind of house quiet that made a person feel very much alone with whatever they were thinking. She sat in her chair by the fire, with the paper in her hands, not the letter from Denver. The territorial notice. She'd been avoiding looking at it again, but avoidance had never served her well, and she was not going to start letting it serve her now. She read it again, and then she sat back and looked at the fire and let herself feel, for just this small window of time, just these few minutes in this quiet room. The full weight of it, all of it. Everything that had followed her from Philadelphia. Everything that had been trailing her since that night in the hospital corridor. The relentlessness of it. The particular exhaustion of a person who has been fighting the same fight in different rooms for years. She was tired of it, not of the work, never of the work, tired of having to prove what should not require proving. She heard the back door, soft steps, the particular weight of him on the boards she'd memorized. He stopped at the edge of the room, looked at her. She didn't look up. He crossed to the fire, sat in his chair, poured her coffee from the pot and set it within reach. Poured his own. They sat. The fire talked to itself. Outside, the mountain made its night sounds. He said, "You're not alone in this." She looked at the fire. 4 words, she said. You said 4 words, they're the right 4. She looked at him. He looked back. Without strategy, without subtlety. Just the plain statement of a man who meant what he said, and had the patience to wait until you believed it. She believed it. She picked up her coffee. "Tell me about Cheyenne," she said. "The courthouse. The judge. Who sits where? Who knows whom? What I'm walking into." And he told her, quietly, thoroughly. Everything he knew, which was more than she expected and exactly what she needed. They talked until midnight, then past it. The fire burned low, and neither of them moved to rebuild it. Outside, the mountain held its breath. 6 weeks. It was enough, it had to be. 6 weeks. That was what she had. 6 weeks to build something solid enough to sit in a courtroom and not fall apart when Silas Prairie pushed on it. 6 weeks to take 8 months of careful work and turn it into something a territorial judge would have. Look out directly and call what it was. Evidence. She started the morning after the notice arrived. Not because she wasn't afraid. She was afraid. She knew exactly what Prairie was capable of, and she knew exactly how these things went when a man with money decided a woman needed to be put back in her place. She'd seen it happen. She'd lived the first version of it. But fear was not the same as helplessness. She had learned that on a mountain. In a winter that should have broken her, in a room with bad light and a boy whose breathing she had to fix with her own hands or lose him. Fear was information, not instruction, so she was afraid. And she worked. The table in the medical room became the center of everything. Her records spread across it. 8 months. Every patient, every procedure, every outcome. Written in her small, precise hand because she had been trained to document and she had never stopped. Even up here, even when it had seemed like no one would ever ask to see it, someone was asking now. She organized it by date first, then by condition, then by outcome. She wrote a summary document, clean, professional, the kind of language she'd used in hospital reports back east, and read it back to herself to hear how it sounded. Adjusted, read it again. Gideon found her at the table at 2 in the morning on the third night. He didn't ask what she was doing. He could see what she was doing. He poured 2 cups of coffee and set one at her elbow and sat at the far end of the table with a piece of paper of his own. "What's that?" she said without looking up. "Names," he said. She looked up. "People in Cheyenne who owe me a fair hearing. People who've known me long enough to speak to my character, if someone needs to speak to it." A pause. "People who've seen you work and will say so." She looked at the list. Even from across the table she could see it was not short. "You've been here a long time," she said. "Long enough," he said. She looked back at her records. "There's something else," she said. "About Prairie. My contact in Denver, Dr. Falk. He wrote something I didn't tell you." He waited. Prairie wasn't just removed from his position in Philadelphia. She kept her voice flat and factual because that was the only way she could say it without something else coming through. There were complaints from other nurses. Before me, going back years. Falk found 2 women who would testify to it. In writing. If necessary, the room was very quiet. They were afraid, she said. The women. They didn't come forward at the time because they knew what would happen. They'd watched what happened to me. A pause. But they've been watching Prairie from a distance since then. And apparently he's done it again. To someone in Denver. And this time someone who could do something about it decided to. She heard Gideon set his cup down. "He's being investigated," she said. "Has been. Since March. I didn't know when I sent the letter. Dr. Falk told me when he wrote back. The silence lasted longer this time. Why didn't you tell me this before? Because I needed to be sure of my own case first." She looked at him. "I didn't want to win because of what he did. I wanted to win because of what I did." He looked at her for a long moment. "Both can be true," he said. "Yes," she said. "But the order matters." He picked up his cup again, drank, looked at the names on his list. "Both things will be in that room," he said. "When the time comes, yes," she said. "They will." She turned back to her records. They worked until the lamp oil ran low. The 6 weeks went not fast, not slow. At the mountain's pace, which was its own pace and answered to nothing. Cub recovered. Fully, this time, which was a relief to everyone, including Cub, who had been increasingly difficult to keep still. By the 4th week, he was on horses again. By the 5th, he was back to being a 19-year-old with too much energy and no adequate outlet for it, which meant he was everyone's problem, and also, she had to admit, a sign that the world was operating correctly. She found him one morning, trying to teach himself to play her flute. Badly, very badly. She stood in the doorway and listened to what could generously be described as sound. He had not noticed her. He was entirely focused on the instrument, frowning at it with the complete concentration of someone who believed that sufficient willpower could substitute for technique. "It could not," she said. "That's not how you hold it." He startled. The flute nearly went out the window. She crossed the room, adjusted his hands, showed him the angle of the mouthpiece. Stood back. He tried again. Still bad. But a recognizable kind of bad. The kind with potential. "How do you know how to do that?" he said. "I thought you said you didn't play." "I've been learning," she said. He looked at her. She looked at the window. "He teaches you," Cub said, slowly, with the dawning expression of someone connecting things. They should have connected some time ago, in the evenings. "That's what you're— I thought you were just talking." "We are talking," she said. "Sure," he said. "Sure you are." She went back to her work. She could hear him behind her, still practicing. Still bad, but trying, genuinely trying. She found she didn't mind the sound at all. Gideon taught her on Thursday evenings. This had happened without discussion, like most things between them. She'd found herself on the porch one evening with the flute in her hands, trying to remember what she'd observed in his hands when he played. He'd come out and sat beside her without comment and watched her try for a moment and then, wordlessly, repositioned her fingers. That had been the start of it. By the third week, she could produce 3 notes cleanly, which was 3 more than she could produce before. Progress was progress. He was patient. Not the practiced patience of a teacher. The natural patience of someone who genuinely did not experience the passage of time as a problem. He waited. He showed. He waited again. He said almost nothing, but what he said was always exactly the thing she needed. One evening she got a phrase right, a small one. 4 notes in sequence, clean and even. She didn't know the name of the phrase. It wasn't a named piece. It was something she'd heard him play, something she'd been trying to reproduce. She got it. She played it twice to be sure, then she looked at him. He was looking back at her, with the particular expression she'd been learning to read. Over 8 months. The one that wasn't quite a smile. The one that lived in the corners and the eyes, and was more real than any broad grin she'd ever seen on anyone. Again, he said quietly. She played it again. She was going to stop herself from mentioning how that felt. She had a hearing to prepare for, but she played it twice more before she went inside. The morning they left for Cheyenne, she was up before the sun, dressed, hair arranged as precisely as she could manage. Her best clothes, not her Philadelphia best, that life was over, but the good dress, the dark blue one she'd bought in town in February. Her medical bag, the stack of documents, organized and tied with string. And one more thing, the letter from Dr. Falk. The formal one, the one with the colleagues' signatures. The one that said, in the language of professional men who chose their words for effect, "What this woman has done is significant. What she knows is real. What she has built in 8 months of frontier practice represents." She had memorized the key sentences. She would not need to. She had them with her. She came downstairs to find the house already moving. Martha at the stove, Amos by the door. Cub was at the table eating, with the focused energy of someone preparing for an event, though she had not told him he needed to prepare for anything. She stood in the doorway. The kitchen was full of people, not just the household. Decker, from the east pasture. The woman who'd come to her with headaches, who turned out to need someone to talk to. Morrison, the man whose ribs she'd set, sitting next to his wife. 3, 4, 5, 8 people at a table built for 4, she said. "What is this?" Amos looked up. He had his traveling hat on. "We're going to town," he said. She looked at the room. "I didn't ask." "No," Martha said, not looking up from the stove. "You didn't." She opened her mouth, closed it. Gideon appeared at the back door. He'd been in the barn. He looked at the room, then at her. Something moved in his face that he let be seen for a moment before he put it back. "Ready when you are," he said. She was not going to cry. She was absolutely not going to cry in front of 8 people in a kitchen at 5 in the morning, because they'd all gotten up early to drive 20 miles to sit in a courthouse on her behalf. She picked up her documents. "Let's go," she said. Cheyenne in September was not Cheyenne in December, which meant it was loud, active. The streets full with the particular commerce of a territory city that had survived another summer and was taking stock of itself. Cowboys, merchants, women with children, men on horses. The complicated human noise of a place that was becoming something while still being something else. She had forgotten, somewhat, what this many people sounded like. The courthouse was on the main street. Stone building, 2 floors, flagpole out front with the territorial flag moving in the September wind. She had been in courthouses before, not as a subject of proceedings, as a visitor, a witness. This was different. She felt the difference in her spine when she walked up the steps. Gideon was at her left. Not touching, not speaking, just there. The fact of him, the solid mountain-rooted, weathered by decades fact of Holt Gideon on her left side, which she had come to understand as a very reliable place for things to be. Inside, the hearing room. Wooden benches on both sides like a church that had decided to become a courtroom without fully committing to either. Prairie was already there. She saw him before he saw her. He hadn't changed. That was the first thought. Same thin face, same precise collar, same hands that were never quite still, always adjusting something. His cuffs, his papers, the position of his pen. A man who was always managing an impression. He looked up, saw her, saw, over her shoulder, what had come with her. She watched him count. She watched his eyes move across the faces filling in behind her. Amos, Cub, Martha, Morrison and his wife, the woman with the headaches, the man from the east pasture, people she hadn't even expected, who must have heard somehow and come, 40. She hadn't counted on the road. She counted now 40 people from her mountain. Prairie's eyes came back to her. Something shifted in them, not fear, not yet, but the recalculation. The adjustment of a man who'd planned for one thing and found another. She held his gaze, then she looked away, sat down, opened her documents. She had work to do. The judge was a man named Hargrove, 60, gray, the face of someone who had heard a great many things and found most of them less surprising than the speaker intended. He looked at the room, at both sides, at the 40 people crowded onto Miriam's benches and spilling into the back. He said, "This is a territorial hearing, not a circus. Everyone in this room will behave accordingly." Nobody moved. He looked at Prairie. "You filed the complaint. You'll present first." Prairie stood. He was good at this. She'd known he would be good at this. He had the voice of a man accustomed to rooms listening to him. Measured. Authoritative. He presented his case in order. That Miriam Voss had been dismissed from her position in Philadelphia for conduct unbecoming, that she had no territorial license to practice medicine or nursing in Wyoming, that her activities on the Gideon property constituted illegal medical practice, and that the territorial government had both the right and the responsibility to act accordingly. He was concise. He was credible. He was, in the way of men who'd spent their lives in rooms like this, very good at sounding like the reasonable one. When he sat down, Judge Hargrove looked at Miriam. She stood. She had prepared a statement. 3 pages. Organized. Every point met with evidence. She'd worked on it for 5 weeks and she knew it completely. She didn't read it. She set it on the table in front of her, looked at the judge, and she spoke. Not about her credentials first. Not about her record. She told him about December, the storm, the boy who would have died before morning and the woman who didn't let that happen. She told it plainly, without sentiment, the way you told a medical case. What the problem was, what she did, what the outcome was. Then she told him about January, 3 women, 3 healthy deliveries in the hardest winter the territory had seen in a decade, then February, then March, then every month after. She put numbers to it, patients seen, procedures performed, outcomes recorded. She had the documentation and she laid it on the judge's bench piece by piece like setting stones for a path. "This is 8 months of work," she said. "Every patient, every treatment, every result. Recorded completely. Because that is what nurses do. That is what I was trained to do. And that is what I have done every single day since I arrived on that mountain." Hargrove looked at the documents. Not quickly. He was reading. Prairie's lawyer said something. She didn't catch all of it, but she caught the key word, unlicensed. She said, "I have a nursing certificate from the Pennsylvania Hospital Training School for Nurses, issued 1881. I have it here." She placed it on the bench. "My dismissal from Philadelphia General was for alleged conduct unbecoming, a charge that was never adjudicated and was based entirely on the word of the man who filed it." She looked at the judge, the same man who is standing in this room today, claiming I am unfit to practice medicine in Wyoming territory. Prairie was very still, she said. I have a letter. She placed it on the bench. From Dr. Edmund Falk of Denver. He reviewed my records. He shared them with colleagues. This letter represents the assessment of 3 qualified physicians, none of whom have met me, none of whom had any reason to advocate for me, all of whom reached the same conclusion about the quality of the work documented in these records. She waited while the judge read it. The room was completely quiet, which was when Amos stood up. He didn't wait to be called, he just stood. From the 3rd row, hat in his hands, left leg giving him trouble, as it always did, but his back as straight as a fence post. Your Honor, he said. My name is Amos Bridle. I've worked the Gideon property for 14 years. My son is alive right now because of this woman. He was 4 years old, and he had a fever that would have killed him before morning, and she sat up all night and didn't stop working until he was out of danger. He paused. I don't know anything about licensing, but I know what it looks like when someone does their job right. And I know what I would have buried if she hadn't been on that mountain. He sat down. Prairie's lawyer stood up to say something about the irregularity of. He didn't finish, because Morrison's wife was on her feet. I carried twins, she said. Both breech. The last woman who tried to help with a birth up here couldn't do anything, and we lost the baby. Her voice was steady. Miriam Voss turned both my boys and delivered them both healthy. In a snowstorm, by lamplight, she looked directly at Prairie. I would like to see your credentials for that, sir. She sat down. Prairie's lawyer tried again. Cub stood up. He didn't say anything dramatic. He just stood. Jacket open. The slight favor he still gave his left side visible to anyone paying attention. He stood and looked at the judge and said, She put me back together twice. I'm 19. I had a lot of years left to lose. A pause. She saved them. He sat down. Judge Hargrove put his hand up. Not sternly. More in the way of a man who wanted to think and needed the room to hold still while he did silence. He looked at the documents, at the letter, at the nursing certificate, at the complaint Prairie had filed. Back at the documents, he looked at Prairie. Dr. Prairie, he said. You have described the complainant as someone dismissed for conduct unbecoming. Can you describe the specific conduct? Prairie said. She physically assaulted a physician. Under what circumstances? A beat. Prairie's first real pause. She misinterpreted a professional interaction and she didn't misinterpret anything, Miriam said. Steady. Flat. He locked the door of the supply room. I had a bedpan. I used it, and I would make the same choice again. The room made a sound, not laughter, something closer to an exhale. The collective exhale of a room that had been holding its breath. Judge Hargrove looked at Prairie for a long moment. Is there anything else you'd like to add to your complaint? He said. Prairie opened his mouth. The back door of the courtroom opened. A man she'd never seen walked in, middle-aged, traveling clothes still dusty from the road. He had an envelope, and he walked directly to the judge's bench and presented it without speaking to anyone else in the room. The judge opened it. Read. His expression didn't change because judges practiced not letting their expressions change. But something shifted, something small and significant. He looked up at Prairie. Dr. Prairie, he said. Are you aware that the Colorado Territory Medical Board has opened a formal investigation into your conduct as a physician? Specifically regarding events in Denver in the spring of this year. The room, the absolute room. Prairie's color changed. She saw it from across the aisle. The particular gray that comes over a face when the thing it's been dreading arrives. That investigation is, he stopped, recalculated. That is a separate matter. It is, the judge agreed, and I am noting it as context only. He set the envelope down, folded his hands. But I will tell you what I find in front of me today, Dr. Prairie. I find 8 months of documented medical practice. I find 3 physicians who reviewed that documentation and found it to represent competent, careful, and in several cases exceptional care. I find a room full of people who are here, not because they were asked to be here, but because they chose to come, to say that this woman's presence on that mountain has saved lives. He picked up Miriam's nursing certificate, set it back down, and I find a complaint filed by a man currently under investigation for professional misconduct against a woman whose only documented offense was defending herself from that same man. He looked at Miriam. Mrs. He checked the document. Miss Voss. Your nursing certificate is hereby recognized as valid within Wyoming territory. Your right to practice is affirmed, and I am recommending to the territorial governor that steps be taken to establish formal recognition of frontier medical practitioners so that the next person in your position has a cleaner path than you did. He picked up his gavel. This hearing is concluded. The sound the room made. She had never heard that particular sound before. Not in a courtroom. Not in any official space. The sound of 40 people who had come from a mountain and driven 20 miles and sat on hard benches and waited. Releasing all of that at once, she stood very still. Her hands were on her documents. Her documents that had done what she needed them to do. Her 8 months of careful, daily, nobody asked for. This work that had turned out to matter after all. Someone hugged her from the left side. Martha. Fierce and brief, and smelling of the kitchen. Cub appeared from somewhere and said something she didn't entirely catch, because her ears were doing something strange. She caught, I told you. And I knew it, and then he was gone again, already talking to someone else. Amos put his hand on her shoulder. Didn't say anything. Just put it there for a moment. She looked across the aisle. Pryor was standing with his lawyer. He was looking at her. His face had gone past gray into something older, something exhausted, something that had been holding a great deal of weight for a long time and could no longer hold it. She looked at him, and she felt not triumph. Not the way she'd imagined triumph would feel back in the worst months. Back when she'd lain awake in cheap rooms and thought about what she would say if she ever had the chance to say it. What she felt was closer to completion, like a wound that had finally closed. Not painless, not as if it had never happened, but closed. Finished. She turned away. She was done looking at him. He was at the back of the room. He had not pushed through, had not hurried. He stood where he'd been standing during the whole of it, near the back wall, and when the room cleared enough for her to reach him, she walked toward him and stopped. He looked at her. She said 4 words. He waited. We did it, she said. That's 4. Something moved in his face that she had no interest in naming because naming it would have made it smaller. He said, you did it. We, she said. The we part matters. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at the room. At Amos collecting his hat. At Cub already at the door, animated, talking too fast. At Martha organizing people toward the exit with the gentle efficiency of a woman who had spent a long time managing moving parts. Ready to go home? He said home. She registered the word, resisted how it landed, where it landed. In which part of her chest? Yes, she said. They walked out. On the way back up the mountain, she didn't speak much. Neither did he. Neither of them did. The wagon was full. Amos driving, Martha beside him. Cub in the back talking to Morrison about something she didn't follow, and the September afternoon was wide and gold around them. And the mountains ahead were the color of something she didn't have a name for. She watched them get larger as they traveled toward them. She thought about the first time she'd seen them. December, dark, storm. The shape of them just a presence in the night. Something immense and permanent that she'd been moving toward without knowing it. She thought about the bench at the train station. $3. The medical bag. The particular quality of that cold. She thought about a letter in an envelope tucked behind a row of books, read and reread and put back in the place where it lived, because you couldn't throw it away and couldn't look at it directly. A door that had been closed by the wrong people. For the wrong reasons. She looked at Gideon. He was looking at the mountains, Prosopsol, the beard, the hat. The lines in his face that were the history of a man who'd spent 30 years in weather, who'd read a second-hand textbook by lamplight in a barn, who'd built a room for a woman he hadn't met yet because there were things that needed doing, and he intended to do them. He felt her looking. Turned, she said, "I want to stay." He didn't pretend not to understand. "You are staying?" "No, I mean..." She stopped, started again. "I'm not staying because I work here. I'm not staying because I don't have anywhere else to go. I have somewhere else to go. Denver wants me to come in November. I could build a practice in Cheyenne. I have options now." She looked at her hands. "I'm staying because..." He waited. She looked up. "Because this is where I want to be," she said. "This is the life I want. Not as an employee. Not as..." She was making a mess of this. She was absolutely making a mess of this. "I'm saying yes to the flute. To whatever you meant when you left it." The wagon hit a rut. She grabbed the side. He grabbed her arm. She looked at his hand on her arm. At his face, he said, "That was not a graceful moment." "No," she agreed. "It really wasn't." He almost smiled. "The corner. The real one." "Yes," he said. "My answer is yes." I said yes first. Then we both said yes. From the back of the wagon, without turning around, Cub said, "It's about time." Amos made a sound that was definitely not a laugh. Martha said, very serenely, "Focus on the road, Amos." The mountains got closer. They were married in October, on the mountain, on a Saturday. In the afternoon, when the light did the thing it did in October, at that elevation, gold and horizontal, and somehow more present than light at any other time of year, she had not wanted a large ceremony. She wanted the people who mattered, in the place that mattered, and nothing else. What she got was approximately 60 people. Because news traveled on mountains the way it always traveled, through the air, faster than any messenger, and no one had been willing to not come. She'd given up objecting somewhere around the third uninvited but entirely welcome family that arrived the morning of. She wore the dark blue dress, the good one. Martha had done something to the neckline that made it look more purposeful. She'd found flowers that were still going in October. Late-season things, small and persistent. The kind that didn't stop just because the calendar suggested they should. She thought her father would have liked Marthesis. She thought he would have stood with his hat in his hands and not let the tears fall. And said, "Miri, you're going to save lives." And she would have said, "I know, Dad. I already am." He was in front of her on the porch that Gideon had built with his own hands. The same hands that had heated water in the dark and held pressure on broken bones and shaped a flute for 4 weeks because he couldn't find the right words. He was wearing his best, which was not a suit. This was not a suit, man. This was a clean coat, good quality, the kind that had lasted because he'd taken care of it. His hair tied back, his beard, which she had made absolutely no attempt to change, because it was part of him the way the mountains were part of him. Just there, just real, just exactly what it was. He looked at her like she was the most serious thing he'd ever looked at, which, from him, was saying something. The preacher said the words. She heard them. She had been afraid she wouldn't, that the moment would be too large, that she'd be too inside it to actually experience it. But she heard every word. She was completely present in a way she hadn't been in years. Maybe ever. "Do you, Holt Elias Gideon?" "Take this woman." "I do," he said, before the sentence was finished. Firm, immediate, like a man who'd been waiting to say it and saw no reason to wait longer. She felt something lift in her chest that had been there so long she'd stopped noticing its weight. "Do you, Miriam Voss? Take this man." She looked at him, at the mountain behind him, at everything she had built from nothing in a year that had started with a storm, and $3 and no direction left but west. "I do," she said. They kissed to an eruption of noise from 60 people who had been holding themselves at considerable restraint and were done holding. Cub made the most noise. Obviously, that evening, the fire, the mountain going dark around them, the party still going in the yard below. Music, Cub's harmonica, someone's fiddle she didn't know the owner of, laughter that carried up to the porch where they'd retreated. She was sitting in her chair. Except now it was just a chair. Just one of two chairs that belonged to both of them, in a house that belonged to both of them, on a mountain that, well, the mountain belonged to itself. But she was part of it now. She felt that. Not as a metaphor, as a fact. He was in his chair, coffee in hand. Watching the dark, she picked up the flute. She had been practicing since July, 4 months. She was not good. She was better than Cub, which was a low bar, but still. She was better, she played the phrase. The 4 notes she'd gotten right the first time, and then the next phrase she'd learned after that. And then the next. She played everything she knew. It wasn't much. It was real. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Your mother's melody, she said. The one you play. Will you teach me that one? He looked at her. It'll take a while, he said. It's long. I have time, she said. He reached across and adjusted her grip on the instrument. His hands over hers for a moment. Warm, certain. He said, start here. She started there. The years went. Not fast, not slow. At the mountain's pace, the medical room on the Gideon property treated its 500th patient in 1893. Miriam recorded this with the same care she'd recorded the first. She drove to Denver in the fall of 1891 and presented her methods to a room of physicians who had come to listen on, and left with more questions than they'd arrived with, which she considered the best possible outcome of any presentation. She presented again in 1893, in 1895, in 1897. The hospital in Cheyenne opened in the spring of 1895, small, practical, built for the work it needed to do, not for appearance. She had been involved in the planning since 1892, and her fingerprints were on every room. The lighting, the ventilation, the nursing station design that put the nurses where they could see everything, because nurses were the ones who saw everything. Gideon's name was on the founding documents. He hadn't asked for that. She'd put it there, the notebook. The field manual. He'd been working on it for years. The herbs, the plants, the mountain knowledge he'd accumulated over a lifetime, and supplemented with everything she'd taught him. She organized it in 1898, wrote the introduction, sent it to Dr. Falk. Falk sent it to a publisher. It was printed in 1901 with both their names on the cover, H.E. Gideon and M.A. Gideon. A field manual of mountain medicine and botanical practice, Wyoming territory. He held it for a long time when the first copies arrived, turned it over, opened it to a page in the middle, read something he'd written, closed it. He looked at her, she said. Well, he said, the binding's good. She laughed, really laughed. The kind she'd been doing for years now, without noticing the switch anymore. The kind that had become just the way things sounded when something was right. The binding, she said. That's your response. It's a good binding, he said. It'll last. She shook her head. He was smiling. The real one, not just the corner. Cub, Nathaniel Gideon. Formally, though no one called him that except official documents, received his nursing certification in 1896. He was the first person from their mountain community to do so. He was not the last. He was present at the ceremony in Denver. So was Miriam. So was Gideon, who wore a suit for the first and possibly only time in his life, and endured it with a stoicism she found genuinely impressive. Cub gave a speech. Of course he did. He was 27, and had become a man who understood that he had things to say and that some rooms needed to hear them. He said, among other things, I was 19 and I was dying and she fixed me. Twice. I have no further commentary on her qualifications. The room laughed. She sat in the front row and looked at her hands. She thought, I was on a bench in a train station. I had $3. I was done believing things got better. And then a door opened. And a man came through it who was not looking for me. And I was not looking for him. And we needed things from each other that were so different from what we expected that neither of us recognized them at first for what they were. But they were. That was the whole of it. She found the letter again in 1906, cleaning out the bookshelf. They'd gotten more books over the years, as people who loved reading tend to do, and the shelves were past capacity. and she'd been systematically going through. The envelope appeared from behind a row of old medical texts. Rocky Mountain Medical Institute, 1879. She held it. She could have put it back. She'd seen it before. She'd processed it. She'd sat with it for a long time and understood what it meant, and chosen to leave it where it lived. But she was 51 now, and things looked different at 51 than they had at 27. She took it out to the porch. He was there. He was often there in the mornings now, when the day was still early and the mountain was doing its slow, gorgeous show. 51 for her, 52 for him. Different at these ages in ways she had not anticipated. Better, mostly. The certainties were more certain. The things that didn't matter had mostly stopped pretending they did. She held the letter out. He looked at it. Looked at her, he didn't say anything. He took it. He read it again. Though he'd read it many times. Though he knew what it said. He read it the way you read things that are part of you. Not for new information, but because it's part of the story and the story still matters. He folded it, set it on the arm of his chair. They were wrong, she said. Yes, he said, not just about you, about what knowledge means, about where it can come from. She looked at the mountains. The manual sold 1,000 copies. It's in 3 medical schools. They were so wrong it's almost, he said. Not bitter, just acknowledging. She looked at him. Does it still bother you? He thought about it. Really thought. The way he did sometimes, he said. But it's part of it, part of what made he gestured. At the house, at the mountain, at the nothing in particular that meant everything particular. This. If they'd said yes in 1879, I would have gone to Denver. I would have become a different man in a different life. A pause. I wouldn't have been on a mountain in December 1887, with a sick boy and no options. She was quiet. I wouldn't have been at the train station, he said. She said nothing for a long moment. Then, the binding was good, he looked at her. On the manual, she said. You were right. The corner moved. I'm often right, he said. Don't push it. He picked up his coffee. She picked up hers. The mountains were doing the morning thing. The light coming in at the angle that made everything look like it had just been decided. Like the world was still in the process of being made, and they were watching it happen. She thought, I have been watching this for 19 years, and I am not done. She thought, I am not anywhere near done. In the museum in Cheyenne, in the gallery devoted to territorial history, there is a glass case in the corner. Inside it, a medical bag, worn leather, brass clasps, tarnished now, a nurse's certificate, mounted behind protective glass, a small wooden flute, paler than the surrounding wood of the display, shaped for smaller hands, and a copy of the field manual open to the introduction. The introduction reads, in part, what you will find in these pages is not theory. It is 30 years of practice on a mountain that did not care about credentials, only outcomes. We offer it not as final authority, but as the start of a conversation between what is known and what is still being learned. That conversation never ends. That is the point of it. The placard beside the case says, Holt and Miriam Gideon. He taught her to read the mountain. She taught him to name what he knew. Together they built something that outlasted both of them. Holt Elias Gideon, 1855–1921. Miriam Ann Gideon, 1860–1924 hers. They are buried side by side on the hill behind the house, the hill that looks down over everything. The pastures and the fences and the buildings and the tree line, and beyond that the mountains, which are not concerned with time the way other things are. The stone is simple. He would have wanted simple. She would have agreed, it says. Holt and Miriam Gideon, they built something real. Visitors still come sometimes, not many. Not tourists looking for spectacle. The people who come to stand on that hill are usually the kind who've carried something for a long time and are looking for evidence that carrying it was worth it. They stand and they read the stone and they look at the mountains. And maybe they think about a woman on a bench in a train station with $3, and a man who came through a door not looking for her and found her anyway. and the long, particular, unspectacular miracle of two people who saw each other clearly and chose, every day for 36 years, to stay. The mountains don't keep records, but they keep everything else. The wind moves through the grass on the hill, the light comes in at an angle, and the mountain holds what the mountain keeps. Which is everything, in the end. Everything that matters.